So we're on this week. I mentioned this in a podcast a few weeks ago, and we were talking about going into the history or a bit of a more in-depth overview on the history, realistically, around straps, around NATO straps, G10 straps, OTAN straps, fabric watch straps, call them what you want to. That's a completely separate podcast where we go on the terminology and the naming of things. But essentially, the vast majority of the community believe, rightly or wrongly, that these straps more or less originated in and around the 40s and the 50s. Now, that's fair because a lot of the content out there that people could consume pushes it in that direction. But with many things in the world, if you scratch a little harder, you can find evidence of far more mature, how do I word this? Far older influences that have been taken into what we now call as the more or less fabric military strap. So what do I mean? Where do we go for? There's a number of spots across the internet, and I'm sure you guys, like me, when you got into watches or at some point in your journey, you've gone and you've read the articles and the blogs, and you found different sources citing different things and different people talking about, different times or different reasons behind the names, etc., etc., etc. And that, what I'm doing today doesn't necessarily say that's wrong. It's certainly not. A lot of that is factually accurate. Pretty much all of it is in many instances. But there are things that happened before that led to that point in time where this, strap was created. So what I want to do today is give you a bit of meat on the bone behind that, take you on a bit of a discovery journey where we start deep diving into one or two of the really solid sources that I've come across in the number of years I've been in this space. I'll try and share some of that knowledge with you guys. I must add a caveat that a lot of this isn't my own work. This is work I've stumbled across on the internet, and these are other people's websites and things like that. And I want to give all the credit and praise to those guys for doing that. And I'll point you in the directions along the way. So perhaps you can, at your own pace or your own leisure, dip in and explore some of this as I have. But like with all good things in the world, we have people out there who are curating a lot of information and compiling it together, and that is what allows us to consume it. So without further ado, I've got the old trusty laptop with me, so we're going to dip into that briefly, and I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. So the first one we're going to have a look at is Teddy Baldassar's website. He's got a super interesting article on the story of the NATO strap, the history, variations, and 10 outstanding watches that go with it. I like Teddy's work. I like what he does. I like how he does it. I like how he puts it together. And I like the fact that he dips into quite a bit of the history on this side of things, where we start going back to the term NATO, what it means, how it has become synonymous with this strap. And when other things started happening as well, like the RAF straps, or what we call the RAF straps, and what a lot of you guys will understand RAF straps to be RAF straps. This is a cracking little resource. Have a little look at this. This will put you firmly, or bring you firmly up to speed, basically with what is widely known and understood to be the origin story of these watch straps. So if you can, head over to Teddy's site. He dips in quite a bit on the James Bond connections, why the guys love it, etc. And you'll pick up quite a bit of knowledge around what is mainstream accepted to be the story behind it. Now, if we head over to a different website, a website belonging to a gentleman called David Botcher. I hope I've pronounced that right. Forgive me if I haven't, David. David's an interesting guy. So we met, must have been 5 years ago, at one of I think it was the British Horological Institute talks that happened. I think it was in Manchester. I was invited over by a local historian. Where we are in Liverpool, there's a little bit more history to watchmaking, particularly in and around the Prescott area, which is just a few miles away from our workshop. Long story short, around about 1900s, very early 1900s, the vast majority of the pocket watches in the British Empire were produced in this region. A lot of it was done on piecework. By that, I mean factories weren't what they are today. There was no Lean Six Sigma or, any sort of process in and around mass production of things. So what actually happened was you had a team of guys working in a factory who would assemble, test and get things ready to go out in the market. But the local community surrounding that area would all take part in piecework. What do I mean by piecework? For example, Frank at number 10 makes hands, but he makes second hands. That's what he does. The factory man would turn up on a Monday. He'd give him a block of brass, the tooling he'd need, and he'd come back on Friday, and he would pay Frank for however many hands he produced. Let's assume Frank got paid a penny per hand. If Frank made 10 hands, he would get 10 pence. If he made 1,000, do the maths. That would happen for every aspect of the watch, or a lot of aspects of the watch. So these guys had basically built it within the community. Then it would be put into the factory, and then it would be, assembled essentially into the finished article. Because there's so much history in and around this area for that, it's prompted a lot of historians, or one in particular, a chap named John Platt, to dig into that history and really understand it, and really understand what sort of impact that's had on the community in which I live and a lot of other people live in this, in that area of Liverpool. Compiled a fantastic book. I got in touch with John and got a copy of that book and chatted about the area because I'm naturally intrigued and interested about it. And John was gracious enough to basically turn on to me and say, Dad, we've got a bit of a function, an event going on over in Manchester next week. Would you like to come along? It's with the BHI, the British Horological Institute. Yeah, no problem, John, let's go. So I jumped in the car and we headed over. I think it must have been winter time. It was dark early. We get there, we walk in, and there was a chap there called David, and he was giving a talk that evening to the group about his research, his findings, and things he stumbled across throughout years and years and years and years of operating in this space. And one of those main things he was talking about is the history of straps. At that time, I didn't really know much about much, but I got the base level story, same as a lot of us had, around the inception or the genesis, really, of that original fabric military strap, 40s, 50s era. So I sat down and received a golden nugget of information from this gentleman, and what he shared with the group was insane. And he's collated that information, he's compiled it with sources, and he's created his own website. On his website, all of this information is there, photographs, imagery, etc. So what I'd like to take you through now is a bit of an overview on that website. So if we head over to our laptop, and we're looking essentially at vintagewatchstraps.com. On this site, this is a golden trove of information. David's worked really hard to collate this together, and understandably, he's very conscious of his copyright. So if you do plan on doing anything with it, please get in touch with him. I've invited him on the show. I don't think podcasting's his thing, but this is something that I've used as a resource and lent into to understand the history of this stuff for such a long time. I think it's right to share it with folks. So hopefully you don't mind, David. But basically, if we look at this inception, wristlets and converters, this is kind of where it starts. So way back in the day, long before wrist watches were a thing, folks would wear pocket watches. That was what a gentleman would wear. He'd pull his pocket watch out and he'd do his thing. But that became impractical in certain scenarios and certain situations. So essentially, a wristlet was formed. And what is a wristlet? Basically, it's a leather strap that your pocket watch would slide into. You can see that on the screen there. This is a pocket watch. This is a leather strap, and it pops in and out. It gives you all the functionality of a wristwatch, but without being a wristwatch. So why was this important? Basically, around the 1885 to 1887 mark, there was a lot going on within Britain and the British Empire. And we had boots on the ground in many, many places across the world. With that and with the practicalities of operating in arduous environments and conditions, pulling out a pocket watch became exceptionally difficult to do if you were a British officer in Burma or riding horses in the cavalry or whatever it may be. So chaps really started wearing their pocket watches on their wrists around this period. This is a picture of the Black Mountain expedition from 1888 in the northwestern frontier in India. Fascinating. 1888, and these guys are wearing wristwatches on their wrist in a military context, to a style that is not dissimilar to what we see today in fabric watches. Now, looking at that really does had a huge amount of time between the inception or the widely accepted inception of military watch straps to this point in time. We're talking a huge jump there, almost 60 years. So this is where it kind of started. This is where it started kicking in through the practicalities, essentially, of what was required during that time by these guys in the field that were operating. And as things progressed, and as the world started to shift, you got to remember, like at this point in time, that like there was a lot going on in the world. We were just on the precipice, really, of the First Great War, and this had already become a thing at that point. By about 10, 15, 20 years, people were used to wearing wristwatches. Warfare changed dramatically during that time, and something I've dipped into a lot on this podcast, other podcasts I've done, is just how much influence military watches, or the military has on watches, or has had on watches for a very, very long time. A lot of the progressions, a lot of the cultural norms now that we would perceive to be just the way it's always been aren't necessarily that way. They've been brought into the mix because of the military. When we start talking about that, think about dive watches, for example. Who were the early adopters of those? Field watches, again. Pilot watches. The military has had such an influence on this space and on this hobby of ours. It would be remiss to think that straps weren't the same, but it does start a lot earlier. So this is 1888. Essentially, there's guys there cutting around wearing a wristwatch. It's a pocket watch on a leather strap, but it's a wristwatch. And as we scroll down this page, and all of this stuff is documented in great detail on vintagewatchstraps.com. I implore you to go and check it out. But as we start scrolling down this page, we can start to see an evolution. So this is a registered design from March 1887. In the UK, when you register designs or you try and chase IP from a business perspective, we have the UK IPO, UK Information Patent Office. If you go in with a design, a pattern, a way things are put together, that's a registered design. That's what's done here. If you're going for a brand, a logo, or a name, that's a trademark. And if you're inventing something from the ground up, from new materials, etc., then that would be a patent. So there's slightly different markers here, but they kind of operate in the same way, dependent on what you're, what area you're working in. So this was a registered design from 1887. And again, it's not a million miles away from what we saw, in and around the Second World War. This style, this fashion of wearing a watch really started to kick in a lot earlier. As we scroll down in this, we start to see it happening more and more and more until we really get to a point a little bit further down the page where we can absolutely see the inception of what really is the NATO strap or the G10 or the O10, word it what you will. So if we crack on here and we keep going through, this is another fascinating piece. Now you can see that the leather surround on this one has been redacted a little bit, and you've just got this back piece there that protects the watch from your skin. How they would do this at that point is they would take a pocket watch, and instead of having a slot to slide it in, guys would weld bars, lugs essentially, at 12 and 6. In some instances, they'd weld the lugs at between 2 and 4 and 7 and 8. That would allow, if you're on a horse you're seeing your 12 o'clock, absolutely in line with you. You aren't going to turn your head to do it. But essentially, they'd weld bars on. You can still find these. If you start looking for trench watches online, you'll get a good example of that. We can do a little quick search there and see what we come up with. Trench watches, if you go to Google Images and slide down a little, we're going to start seeing that style popping up and being a thing. This is, in many instances, retrofit, but as with everything, once the industry gets wind that this is what people are doing or people are wanting to do, it became the norm in that environment. So they'd have something similar on when they left the factory. Also, the onion crowns were moved from 12 to 3 to accommodate such things. But in all intents and purposes, these are pocket watches that have been retrofitted to become wristlets or wristwatches. This particular one there is from 1903, the one we just clicked off there. But we can start to see that progression, that evolution come through. As we scroll down even further, we can start to see buckle designs start coming in. 1907 on this particular one. E.J. Pearson and Sons. A lot of history here. Based in St. John Street in London. Trace their roots back to the early 1800s, essentially. But these guys have got a lot to answer for when it comes to the G10 now. If we click or look at their Victor strap, that's in essence exactly what it is now. Not a lot has changed. And I think the Victor on this site leads me to believe that it was around about 1908 when this kicked in. That's the Simplex version, where you've got that slightly wider tail end. But the Victor, this is where it all began. This is realistically, I think it was a registered design based on this in Switzerland in 1903. That is phenomenal. That is almost unheard of. No one talks about it. I've been aware of it for a very long time. I've put people onto it and point them in the direction of this website and where this research has been done. But it's not widely known now. It needs to be. It should be. This is the real ancestor, the predecessor to what we know now as the G10. After that came into effect, and after that became the norm, and after the war fighting really started kicking off with the Great War, wearing wristwatches became a bit more socially acceptable. Up until that point, really, it was viewed to be more feminine to wear a wristwatch. That's something ladies did. Gentlemen would carry a watch in their pocket. With the Great War kicking off the way it did, and with that many people getting involved in that conflict, and it lasted as long as it did, it really normalised the wearing of wristwatches because it was far more practical. And when the lads came back, they were that used to it at that point that it became a norm, it became the thing. But even if you look at the history around, guys being sent off, that war happened, it started. We're not going to get into the politics of it now. But essentially, if you were a British officer, you were given an allowance, and with that allowance, you had to go and buy your kit and equipment. Some of that would be a revolver. Some of that would be a wristwatch. You could need a pair of binoculars, etc. So guys basically turned up to their local jewelers at the time and said, I have an allowance for this. Please, could you assist me and give me what you think I need? At that time, pocket watches were still a big thing, but the wristwatch started really, really, really finding its feet then. As we progress in time, the natural transition started to happen. So we talk about a pocket watch being worn in a wristlet, just a little overview now. The wristlet then changing because the lugs have been welded onto the pocket watch. The pocket watch then really ceasing to be a pocket watch and becoming a wristwatch. And then post the Great War, people getting used to wearing wristwatches or having worn a wristwatch. It's a bit of a tongue twister, this. Having worn a wristwatch for a number of years, it basically became the norm. That's what happened. Then we move forward in time, and the Second World War kicked in, and then we start looking at things like the Dirty Dozen. And again, looking back at the influences, not only on the straps, we can start to see that history or that pattern come together there, but also on the style of watches. If you look at the Dirty Dozen, in their essence, It's a plain face, bold numerals in a very similar fashion to what you find on a pocket watch. An onion bulbous crown, very similar to what you find on a pocket watch, somewhat scaled down a little, but the styling is there. And the only major difference really is these came with actual lugs built into the case that were somewhat billeted out of the same piece of metal, machined out of the same piece of billet. But that gives a bit of an overview on the natural progression around watch straps, and around how influential the military and the military history's been on that. So I would implore you guys to go out and do some research on the history of it and try and understand it. There are a number of websites out there who have got stories and variations of that story and iterations of it. And as with most things in life, there's no definitive spot you should go and only consume information from. So I implore you to go and check all of these guys out. Have a look, at what they've written, how they've put it together, and what the influences were around the article. That'll give you a decent insight into a wider view, really, of how this whole thing came together. But for now, I think we've covered off quite a bit there on the history side of things, and possibly opened your mind a little to some alternative information that hasn't been suppressed. There's no conspiracy here, but the exceptions widely regarded to be 40s, 50s. It's my opinion, and it's just my opinion. It's a little older than that, and that really for me harps back to that Pearson Victor strap, which really is the predecessor to the G10. So, websites I recommend, go and check out Teddy's story. Have a little look what he's got going on there with the history. He's got a comprehensive overview of a number of things there, talking history on the strap. I really like the Gear Patrol article, simply because one of the first images you hit on that, if I show you this here, is that watch, the Longines. Now that Longines, tell me that is not a pocket watch that has influence that design process. The dial is exactly the same, sub-second style, very clear sword hands and numerals, a bulbous onion crown. The only difference really in that is the lugs. But you can see the natural progression now, and you can see how that styling has come together. And that paired with something like the Victor G10 strap, the Pearson strap, phenomenal. Back in the day as well, they did all that with leather. So it gets super interesting. Narrow fabrics and tapes and things like that. They did exist. They were around. You can find some very, very early pieces of that. But a lot of people during that time frame, late 1800s, early 1900s, were moderately competent in crafting a little bit of leather, something that a lot of people had to deal with in their day-to-day lives. Life was a little harder then. So leather was the way to go. That's what everyone made stuff out of. That was certainly what was being worn, during this time period with these pieces. And that is, you fast forward that to today and us doing our single pass leather straps, which for a lot of people, they're like, wow, so why would you make a single pass out of leather? Well, why wouldn't you know in the history? So yeah, head over to the Gear Patrol site, check out, see what they're doing. Another solid spot there is the Thrifty Gentleman. They start talking about the James Bond strap and everything you need to know. Naturally, these straps became very prevalent or very popular after Mr. Connery wore one in the Bond films, and they really started picking up a lot of traction then. But as I say, if you scratch at the surface, you find a lot more history there. So for now, I'm going to leave you with that little golden nugget. VintageWatchStraps.com. If you want something that's truly accurate to the time frame, he also does straps there. So if you've got an old piece that maybe you've inherited from a family member, I'd implore you to go over and head over and have a look, see what they're up to. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it. I hope you spend a little bit of time uncovering this treasure trove of information across the internet and really understanding the history and the inception and where this stuff sort of began and how it came together. As I have, I find it fascinating, and it's influenced me in my personal life, but also in the business. So yeah, until next time.